Welcome to Disciples of Christ History. My name is Steve Regas. I'm a member here at Liberty Christian Church in Liberty, Missouri. I am leading a 15-week series on the history of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I've been asked to say a little bit how this series came about. A few of you may know that I'm currently working on a book called Seeking Christ. It's about the difference between liberal Christians and conservative Christians. In the end, it will suggest at least, to find a way to bridge their differences. In working on that book, I recently completed a pretty long chapter on the history of Christianity. The second factor is that Dave Culver, the pastor of this congregation, asked me last summer to teach a series on the history of the disciples of Christ, as there were a fair number of members of this congregation who really weren't aware of that. The third factor came in, and this got the region involved. I'm currently mentoring a candidate for commissioning in the region. And as part of the process, he has to take a class in the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. Unfortunately, there's no really good local option for that. And in speaking with the region, they said if he watches this series, it would fulfill that criteria for him, but they would also like to put it on the regional website for anyone else who wanted to study the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. I am honored to have you as my guest for this, and thank you for being here.
Live long and prosper. We all remember Mr. Spock's famous words on Star Trek. What does that have to do with the disciples of Christ? And I'll tell you shortly. Working on the lesson this week, I actually was able to consolidate two sessions, I hope, today. And next week's going to be a little different. It's going to be interactive. You're actually going to be around tables and doing some homework. We have homework for this week, and then I'll have projects, kind of like VBS. So, live long and prosper. We finished last week, January 1st, 1832, the merger of the disciples and the Christians. And Alexander Campbell lived long, and the disciples of Christ prospered. This is roughly our story from 1832 to roughly 1866, when Alexander Campbell, the last of the four founders, passed away. One of the remarkable things about our movement was just how long he was in charge. Probably by 1811, he was only about 23 then, he was the recognized leader certainly of the half of the movement he and his father and Walter Scott formed. He was, as I think we talked about last week, a well-educated man, a dominant personality, a mover and a shaker. And my friend Newell Williams, in his disciple history class, when he gives a full 3-hour lecture on each of the founders. It is interesting, in Thomas Campbell's, he ends the whole story the day Alexander Campbell sets foot in America, because at that point, Thomas Campbell's contribution is negligible once his son gets here. Now, if you think about it that's 55 years. I mean, what kind of a movement has its principal founder for 55 years? Now, true, by the time it was over, he was old and senile. But you know what's the name they always have for Warren Buffett? The Sage of Omaha? Campbell was the Sage of Bethany, where his home, his estate, his school was. And he was the leader for a very long time. And it's kind of like, as we're going to see, as long as you have the founder there, I suspect a lot of businesses are this way. As long as the founder is there to provide the leadership, the vision, everybody's going to stay together. But when the founder goes, there will be competing visions for what that means. So he lived long, we prospered. And let me give you some idea of how well we prospered. In 1832, there were roughly 20,000 people at the merger. One of the things that will come up later is you had the Stone churches, the Campbell churches, the disciples and the Christians. Now again, these are all independent-minded people. You don't, it's like being a farmer. You don't become a farmer to be told what to do. You don't join the Disciples of Christ church to be told what to believe. And so when the Stone people, the Campbell people merged, as I've already alluded to, who won out ideologically? Campbell. Now, in modern day, it's not, disciples look more to Stone. But on almost all the controversial issues, the Campbell people won. And so some of the Stonites who'd been here longer, Stone started this movement when Walter Scott and the Campbells were still in the old world, said, we're giving up too much to join. So every congregation had to make a decision, and there were a group that Stone couldn't get in. And I believe they were called the Christian Connection. It was a very small group, maybe a few thousand. But they continued on, and they will actually, literally in we don't hear about the Christian Connection in our movement again until 1989. But we'll get to them. They may be gone for a long time, but not forgotten. So anyway, our movement started in 1832 with 20,000 people. In 1860, before the Civil War began, we had 190,000 people. Now, of course, it's always like, churches in the core city looking at suburban churches that are growing will say, yeah, you're growing because your population's growing. You could look at this and say, yeah, the population on the frontier of the United States during that time, which was, going from Kentucky and Pennsylvania to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, was growing, but we grew at 4 times the national rate. What made the Disciples of Christ so popular? And it's been called the 4 P's. This was a man named Claude Spencer. First was preaching, is that disciples were good preachers. The second was publishing. We live in an unusual time now. There's no official Christian church magazine. For years we had The Disciple. Before that, I believe it was called The Christian Evangelist. And, what was there after The Disciple failed, there was another one that was started briefly and it failed. So we don't have a house journal anymore. But that's a rarity, because one of the things that the early leaders of the Disciples of Christ loved to do was start newspapers, magazines. There were literally scores of magazines that were formed. And it's been said that disciples don't have bishops, they have publishers. And that if you wanted to become a leader in the movement, you put out a newspaper, a magazine, and people read it. And that's how you made your influence. So preaching, publishing, pedagogy. We've got some teachers here. What does pedagogy mean? Teaching. Disciples like to form newspapers. They also like to form colleges. If you ever sit down and read a history of the Disciples of Christ colleges, it's almost ridiculous. the number of schools that our church has formed, more than could ever possibly survive. But you know, it's like every leader, let me get a newspaper, let me start a school. And of course, early on the frontier, oftentimes the Christian schools predated the state schools. And it was a way to educate many people, but particularly educate pastors. So we have publishing, preaching, pedagogy, and the last P was the plea. Anybody remember what the plea was? It's not a court term. The plea for Christian unity, based upon the idea that if we all go back to what it showed in the New Testament alone, you know, if we approach it with, you know, a clean slate and not the prejudices of the old world, that we could all agree on a primitive Christianity. Of course, from Candle's standpoint, that was his idea of what it was. But again, this is a new experiment in humankind, America. As people came over and established a new order, a new life, Campbell's idea, Scott's idea, Stone's idea of bringing churches together based on the New Testament pattern was very resonant. And those four things led up to this fantastic growth we had in 28 years. Now, anybody ever start a business? No entrepreneurs here. Do I see one hand in the back maybe? Okay, oh yeah. If you start a business early on, you have maybe a few employees, you do all the work yourself. But if you're successful, what happens?
You hire people to do your work.
Well, you hire people to do your work, and then it gets bigger, and then what kind of problems do you have? So you know, it's like this. If you go to the McDonald's in Liberty, Missouri, and order a Big Mac, and you went to McDonald's in New York City or London or Paris and got a Big Mac, it would be the same. McDonald's prices itself on that. But the organization to ensure uniformity, you know, it's not like 1960 where Ray Kroc could visit every store. As you get bigger, you have to have an organization. Because as Roger could tell us, it's not cheap to run a college. You know, you've got all these colleges, you want to do fundraising, raise money, get people to support, as they said, our schools. There's another reason for standardization. Have you ever heard of a minister taking advantage of a church? I see some heads shaking. That's something in modern denominations we work really, really, really hard to prevent. I am glad that I was ordained, 38 years ago. Because the hoops you have to go through to get ordained in the disciples today are far higher than they were then. But that protecting congregations from unscrupulous would-be pastors is important. It's important now, it was important then. Because there are people who prey upon churches. How do you establish who's legit and who's not? You need an organization. The 1800s were the great century of sending missions from Europe and America to the world. Could Liberty Christian Church engage a missionary on its own and send him or her to somewhere else? We could, but it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be easy. To do those things, you need an organization. The problem is, what Stone got kicked out of his organization. The Campbells got kicked out of their organization multiple times. That's what we were rebelling against, an organization. But suddenly, you can't run a 190,000 member movement with just saying every church do it at once. So there began to be a need for an organization. And they would, but they had to be very careful, because this is, you start talking about, denominations and bishops, that's just what, we were against. This is from Tucker and McAllister, the book I quote every week. This is what Campbell wrote. We can do comparatively nothing and distribute the Bible abroad without cooperation. We can do comparatively but little in the great missionary field of the world, either at home or abroad, without cooperation. We can do little or nothing to improve or elevate the Christian ministry without cooperation. We can do but little to check, restrain, and remove the flood of fraud committed upon the benevolence of the brethren by irresponsible, plausible, and deceptious persons without cooperation. We cannot concentrate the action of tens of thousands of Israel in any great effort, but by cooperation. Alexander Campbell said we need an organization. We need a national organization. And I suppose if anybody else said this, it might be it was still controversial. But remember, he the man. And if Alexander Campbell said we need a national organization, well, we needed a national organization. And that's what we got. In 1849, the first assembly of the Disciples of Christ was held in Cincinnati, Ohio. And guess who was elected president? Alexander Campbell. And they formed something called the this is going to be a pattern over and over again. That everything that was formed was the something Christian Missionary Society. So they formed the American Christian Missionary Society, and guess who was elected president of that? Alexander Campbell. Now there was some controversy, but that's how it was. And every year there was an annual meeting, and I believe that most of the years Alexander Campbell was elected president. So this ends Live Long and Prosper. I'm going to move into session 2. It was originally going to be a whole week. You remember Frank Sinatra's song, I Did It My Way? Let me suggest to the disciples of Christ, we've done things our way. Now, today, in probably the next 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about, in my opinion, the 2 major issues that affected every Protestant church in this country from the day America was founded until now. The first of those was slavery. You ever play the game where kids kick the can? That was kind of the American, the topic was so hot that let's just kick the can down the road and maybe it'll go away on its own. Of course, that didn't happen. The issue became more and more heated as the United States moved farther west, and there was the question of, as new states admitted, are they going to be slave or are they going to be free? The issue became more and more troublesome. The second issue, by the way, is the conservative, liberal, modernist, fundamentalist split that occurs later. But we're talking about the early 1800s. We're just dealing with slavery at this point. As the issue became more heated in the first 60 years of the 1800s, it became to be a problem in churches. In 1844, the Methodist Church split, into northern and southern Methodist churches. 1844, any idea when they got back together? 1939. Took a while. The Presbyterians split in 1858. Any idea when they got back together?
I think it was in the 70s, because I was a Presbyterian.
70s, 80s range. There are so many different Presbyterian organizations, they all sound the same. The date I have is 83, but there were so many mergers and unmergers, it's hard to be sure. The Episcopalians were interesting. The year the war started, 1861, they split. The year the war ended, 1865, they got back together. What about the Baptists? They split in 1845 into the Southern Baptists and the Northern Baptists. Did they ever get back together? No. The Northern Baptists changed their name to American. And certainly, I'm not sure how much the American Baptists have tried to push south, but the Southern Baptists certainly have pushed north. What about the disciples of Christ? We did, obviously, if you think about the states we're growing in, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Virginia, some of those are slave states, some of those are free states. What's a church going to do? Because our whole reason for being is that if we simply get back to the Bible, the New Testament, then human issues can't split us. And so, in a sense, if the disciples split over slavery per se, it would basically be saying our whole issue, our whole premise of existence is worthless. Indeed, and so, again, what did Mr. Campbell, the sage of Bethany, say? And you know, when you're a leader of a movement for 55 years in a fluid time, you say a lot of things. It's really a good thing that Alexander Campbell did not live in the world of videotapes, because there's a number of issues, probably slavery included, where he could be quoted on either side. And he tried, it's like today, if you try to be a moderate and straddle the fence, neither side likes you. He tried to straddle the fence, and the disciples of Christ did not split during the Civil War. But something happened. Something happened. Remember we talked about the American Christian Missionary Society? They met typically in Cincinnati. Was Cincinnati in the Union or in the Confederacy? It's in the Union. So when they had their yearly meetings during the war, who showed up? The Northerners. In 1863, the American Christian Missionary Society, let me read this, decided to abandon neutrality and take a position, not surprisingly, on the side of the Union. In Cincinnati, resolved that we unqualifiedly declare our allegiance to said government of the United States and repudiate as false and slanderous any statement to the contrary. That we tender our sympathies to our brave and noble soldiers in the field who are defending us from the attempt of armed traitors to overthrow our government, and also to those bereaved and rendered desolate by ravages of war. Resolved that we earnestly and constantly pray to God to give our legislatures and rulers wisdom to enact and power to execute such laws as will speedily bring us the enjoyment of peace that God will deign to bless. The American Christian Missionary Society came in on the side of the USA rather than the CSA. If you were disciples of Christ living in Tennessee, what would you think of that? If you were a disciple living in Texas, what would you think of that? Particularly if you were serving or if you had lost loved ones in the war serving for the Confederacy, you wouldn't be very happy. The war ended. But stop and think. I'm going to get a drink first. Hang on. The war ended. I've told you before about the most famous or infamous pastor of this church, Moses Lard, who published, yeah, I know. What's even funny, he published, they all had their own publications. He had one called Lard's Quarterly. Lard was the guy who, I think his basic sermon started at 2 hours. Well, while we're on slavery, I always give Culver a hard time about this. Before as he was alluding in last week's sermon, he was called here from the First Christian Church of Atchison, Kansas, which is probably not quite as old as this, but pretty old. You remember that Kansas was a hotbed of dissent between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery people. There was a very famous Christian evangelist named Pardee Butler, who may have been the first pastor of that church, but one of Dave's predecessors at Atchison. He was an ardent abolitionist, and that did not necessarily set well with his city or his congregation. And no matter whatever happened to a minister at Atchison, Kansas in the First Christian Church, it could not be as bad as Pardee Butler. They wanted to tar and feather him, but they didn't have feathers. They tarred and cottoned him. They put him on a raft in the Missouri River and set him afloat. Now, he survived, and he literally formed scores, if not hundreds, of churches after the war, but I always kid Dave about that. But Moses Lard, our most famous pastor at Liberty, said after the war, we can never split, because by golly, we had come through this intact. But again, as Mr. Sinatra said, I did it my way. Our split, we had a split over the Civil War, but it wasn't before the war started. During the 4 years of the Civil War, where did most of the fighting occur? North or south? South. There were some engagements up. Missouri was a Union state. We had battles here. Gettysburg was in Pennsylvania. But most of the fighting was in the South. And certainly near the end. You've heard of Sherman's March to the Sea? How did he do that? Scorched earth. Basically wiped out a huge swath of Georgia. Abraham Lincoln, his dream was that the North and South be restored to harmony in a magnanimous fashion. That the South would be treated as wayward brothers and sisters and not conquered traitors. What happened to Abraham Lincoln? He died. And when he died at the hands of a Southern sympathizer, his dream of a magnanimous reconciliation ended. And what we got was Reconstruction, a time that was very difficult on an already impoverished South. So you have two very different Americas. You have the northern half that had won the war. Most of the battles had not been fought there. The North was an economy that did not thrive on slave labor, which the South had to change. The North was relatively prosperous, and the South was very poor. Now, if you lose a war, how do the vanquished feel about the conquerors? They don't like them. How do people who are poor feel about people who are rich? Not necessarily like them. Any of you remember the Old Testament prophet Haggai? I was just hoping somebody would say, yes, Steve, I remember Haggai. He spoke in 520 BC. Anyway, The reason you don't remember him is because disciples don't need to hear his message. Because, seriously, at least disciples in northern United States in 1870, 1880 didn't need to hear his message. Haggai said the people had returned from Babylon about 538 BC, started the temple, and then for a various number of reasons it got stalled. Haggai said 18 years later, you all have nice paneled houses. You finished your houses, but the house of the Lord lies in ruins. You didn't have to tell disciples that, because as disciples became prosperous after the war in the north, they wanted, you have a nice house, you want a nice church. Anybody know the only minister who ever became president? Oh, people. James Garfield, a disciple minister. James Garfield, a disciple minister, became president. Again, unfortunately, he, like Mr. Lincoln, he was assassinated in the first year. But the story is told he lived in the White House. But when he went to church, it was the disciple church in Washington was this little building, and it was so inauspicious that while the president was in service, his carriage man would pull the presidential carriage in front of a bigger church because it looked more dignified. But that's actually how we got National City Christian Church, is that so we could have a first-class church in the nation's capital. But in many churches in the north, we have a nice home. And how many of you have a piano in your house? How many of you have an electronic organ? I'm guessing nobody has a pipe organ, but people began to have instruments in their house. They began to have stained glass. You know how the old Victorian houses had stained glass windows? They began to have nice stuff. And unlike Haggai, the people Haggai preached to, they wanted their church to be nice also. Now, in 1880, is it easier to run a capital campaign in Ohio or in Alabama? Moses Lard said we could never divide. And we couldn't divide over the principle. But are you beginning to see the resentment? These poor little churches in the south and these nice churches in the north. The other thing is, they began to have, this is sexist, but it was true then, the one-man system. That, originally the idea was that you get a bunch of elders of the church, lay people, and they're the pastors, they're the one that preach on Sunday. How long would we be able to function if that really happened? A little while. But if we didn't have a seminary-trained pastor who could devote his or her full time, most churches would sink. And again, other churches had seminary-trained or college-trained in those days full-time pastors. Why shouldn't disciples? Now again, if you're a church in Indianapolis, you have the money to have your stained glass windows, have your pipe organ, and have your full-time preacher. But if you're down in Tennessee or Texas, and you're still trying to get over the crippling poverty of the post-war years, you can't have those things. So, there was a third thing, though. Remember the American Christian Missionary Society? A group of churches that came together from all over the country. I keep doing this. But in the end, when push came to shove, whose side were they on? The North. And so what began to happen probably around 1880 was the Southern churches said, you have abandoned our principles. Where in the New Testament does it say that you can have a full-time paid minister in your church? Now, they would agree there were evangelists, but the one-man system was in their eyes unbiblical. Of course, the most famous part of the controversy was instrumental music. There are two ways of looking at this phrase. Where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the scriptures are silent, we're silent. You could take that either liberally or conservatively. Does the Bible permit instrumental music? In the Old Testament, absolutely. Absolutely. But again, remember the principle. We're not an Old Testament people. Campbell and Scott said the Old Testament may be God's word, but it was God's word for people then. We live by the 27 books of the New Testament. And if you look carefully, the Southern Christians would have said, we don't see where there's a piano, we don't see there's an organ, we don't see there's a guitar, we don't see any apostolic precedents for instrumental music. And so if you all are using that, you've broken the principles. And finally, they continued to make more missionary societies. Women will like this, ladies here. When we tried to evangelize the world, the men in charge of the disciples made a huge mess. Just a huge mess. They were lousy at it. It was after the war that, I think it was Women's Christian Missionary Society came about. It was run totally by women. And it was the one that actually got things moving. And then there was a foreign Christian missionary society. And there were state Christian missionary societies. And the people in the South are saying, hey, wait a second. Look what this missionary society did to us. Do you find anywhere in the Bible evidence for needing a missionary society? Is there any evidence in the New Testament? Yes, we're going to form the Jerusalem Christian Missionary Society. None.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
But isn't that what what was sent out to everybody to go evangelize? Isn't that the same thing?
I can't hear you, Jen.
I'm sorry. Isn't it the same thing? Like they were told to go out, like in the New Testament, they were told to go out and spread the word. Isn't that the same thing as
It could be construed as the same thing, depending on how you wanted to look at it.
But they didn't want to look at it.
They didn't want to look at it that way. I mean, absolutely, you're right. I mean, the church in Antioch was Paul's sending center. But they didn't call themselves the Antioch Christian Missionary Society. They didn't have a secretary. It's a matter of semantics. It's a matter of one people being ticked off at the other and finding a reason, which is a lot of times what church fights are. There's an underlying issue, but there's some, the church I served in Hiawatha split, I think it was 13 years before I was there. There was all sorts of underlying issues, but the straw that broke the camel's back was what Sunday school literature they were going to use. This is like that. People were mad in the South. They resented the progress, the victory, the good life they had in the North. And by golly, they didn't want a one-man system. They didn't want instrumental music in church. And they didn't want a representative missionary society. And so basically, there was a split that occurred from about 1880 to 1900. And individual churches made their decision which way they were going to go. Our branch was the Disciples of Christ. The branch in the South became the Church of Christ, the non-instrumental Church of Christ. And forgot a point. Let me get a soda. I lost a point here. Again. Where do you think the Church of Christ was predominant? Boston? Not hardly. New York? 75% of the churches of Christ that broke away were in the states of the former Confederacy. It's a joke that if you drive through a town in Arkansas, is there more Baptist or Church of Christ in a town? But this was our first split. And again, we did it our way. Make no mistake that this is about the Civil War, and it's about slavery. It's just that it happens after the fact, and there are other reasons for what caused it. Any questions so far? Yes?
You may be getting ready to get to this. I didn't grow up in Missouri. Where was Liberty Christian Church in all of this?
Liberty Christian Church, and some of you have been here longer than I. As you know, it's interesting to think, and I was off at Fairview when this happened. Liberty Christian Church was shut down by COVID, but not by the Civil War.
I've read the story, but I've always wondered where we, as a church at that time, were on slavery.
Pam, Celeste, your families probably go back, obviously not then, but you know, no. But you probably know the history as well as anyone. My understanding is that there was a Union man, a Southern man, and a pacifist. Celeste is shaking her head, yes. Those were the three people that kept the church together. And so that's kind of how during the war the disciples were. It'd be interesting to know afterwards how those three people fared, if they were still alive in the 1880s. But this church was kept alive by a coalition of people from very different views. And that's a great point. Any other questions, comments, funny stories? Points of order for the good of the congregation? Okay, I'm assigning homework. Next week is going to be a little different. When you get here, you're going to be broken. Oh my. Maybe I should put it there. Next week, you will find yourself broken into tables. And there will be little things to do on the table. It's kind of like VBS. No treats. If there, yeah. Do you want to be in charge of singing? I mean, you know, if there wasn't COVID, I might actually have treats, but we can't do that. So, but there's one question you need to research before you come in next week. If you take a look at the Old Testament, you will find two words for Lord, L-O-R-D. And you will also find capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. And if you have any questions about where to find that, just read the first 10 chapters of Genesis. It becomes pretty obvious. I want you to be able to tell me what's the difference between Lord and Lord, because that will become very important for next week.